our case study, we've done a very simplified version of a case study. We have only a few questions and only a few pieces of information, and those pieces of information we did are simplified in their form because we wanted to sort of start with something that everybody could sort of see and understand what was going on. For the actual ones, it will likely be longer sets of information. You might get much longer pieces of code, for example. You might have a much fuller program or other pieces of information. But this was just meant to sort of get us up and started and start thinking about these issues. So here we are in the initial scenario, and what we're talking about here is for this particular case study, you are the architect for a new office building for a small to mid-sized business. That business has needs that will be obvious. There's sort of administration, financial department, marketing, people like that, and less obvious, something called prototyping, which presumably has a shop area and sort of other places where things actually get made. The client has some specific ideas about how the workplace should operate and how it should feel, how people want to be able to communicate, essentially what the experience should be like for people who are working there. But there are certain realities that must be dealt with as well, such as the site has had a previous use and its attendant contaminations, and the city is intent on that we follow the zoning rules. There are a few questions that the issues covered can be found in the supporting documents. There's a few questions there you can probably answer without really even going through the supporting documents. Some may be able to be answered from one document. Others may have to be interpolated between multiple pieces of information as we go through the multiple sources.
Mike, before we hop into this, we did have one question, which I thought is pretty good, from @BrenChampRiley on Twitter. He asks, talking about these case studies, he says, is it possible to fail both the case studies and pass the exam?
That's a really good question. The answer is, and I'm slightly guessing here because we've talked to NCARB, we have a pretty good sense of the information, but they're also still a little, they don't want to go through too closely. And it's actually a much more complicated question than you might think, especially in the early days of a new exam. One of the things about the early days of a new exam is that you get a whole rush of new questions, and they have to test those questions. And so the people who are taking the first, for the first number of months, maybe even the first year, some percentage of the questions that you get asked will be test questions. They won't actually count. But you don't know which ones they are. You don't know how many of those are counting for you or counting against you. It's completely possible that you could have two case studies and one entire case study doesn't actually count for or against you. It's just a test to see, does it make sense? Can people answer the questions? Does it work? I would bet that if you, presuming that the case studies are counting, that if you had two sets of case studies and you failed both of them, I don't really know how you'd fail a case study because you probably would answer at least some of them correctly and some of them incorrectly. So it's not that if I get 4 out of 20 wrong, I've failed all 20. It's that it just adds to my plus and minus count for the overall exam. But let's say I did very poorly on both of those. And it was 2 case studies. That's a lot of questions. Maybe it's 20 questions each, something like that, or 20 and 15 or something. That's a pretty big percentage. So if you did very badly on the case studies, that would probably be meaningful and be a problem. But remember, they're just questions, right? They're just questions like all the other questions, and it's just that they're grouped together. And so there's going to be certain advantages and there's going to be certain disadvantages. The disadvantages, you have to kind of get your head wrapped around it, right? When a question is self-contained, if your mind is elsewhere for a second, you just stop and you reread the question, and it's pretty straightforward how to get yourself back into the exam. But in a case study, you've got all these different floating pieces of information. You got to figure out which ones are meaningful, and so that can be pretty tricky. But the big advantage to it is they're all about the same thing, right? So once I'm sort of rolling along, I can notice other pieces of information. I can go back and change and correct an answer. I can, there's all these sort of advantages of it kind of being all together. And that's the point, right? The point is that it's more mimicking the way that an actual project goes. So I love the question, although I'm going to push back on you and say, don't be worried about it, man. Like, what, you're already worried about failing the case study? Come on, you're going to be fine. It's all going to work. It's all going to be great. That just think of it as other questions. They're just grouped together.
Yeah, I remember Jared saying, remember
Yeah.
these questions, they are worth the same amount
Yeah.
as any other question. So case study questions aren't worth 2 points and all the others are worth 1.
Right,
But they're
or
all-
if you get 5 wrong on the case study, it doesn't mean the whole thing, the whole group goes out.
Right.
It just means you got 5 wrong out of
Yeah.
that group of 20 or whatever the number
and
is.
really out of the entire
Out of the whole thing.
entire
yeah.
exam. So anyways.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Sorry to interrupt there.
Okay, so let's jump on back here. So that's our scenario. The scenarios that they give, my guess is that some will be very limited because they want you really to dive into the specific pieces of information that they're giving you on the tabs, and some might be very extensive. You might actually have to read the scenario. It might be a couple pages long because they're giving you a lot of information in that, and you need that information in order to really attack maybe like the code or something like that that they're putting forth for you.